They called it the bloodiest confrontation in human history, a war that raged across endless plains, swallowing entire cities and leaving millions unaccounted for. But was the Eastern Front of World War II truly beyond anything we've ever imagined? Some say the numbers don't lie. A staggering 28 million Soviet citizens lost their lives, while entire nations reeled under a storm of violence and destruction. Yet even these harrowing figures barely scratch the surface of the controversies, rumors, and hidden stories buried in the rubble. Today, we're diving into the lesser-known horrors, the shocking decisions, and the brutal truths that turned this front into a nightmare unlike any other. Before the first shots were ever fired, a sense of impending doom hung over Europe. Adolf Hitler had already swallowed up territory at an alarming rate, testing how far he could push without triggering all-out conflict. Meanwhile, Joseph Stalin unleashed deadly purges that eradicated high-ranking officials and stoked fear throughout the Soviet Union. Despite their clashing ideologies, these two dictators struck a non-aggression pact in 1939, secretly carving up Eastern Europe between them. But beneath the public handshake lay rumors of deeper schemes. Many believe Hitler fixated on Soviet oil and farmland, convinced that controlling them was the key to conquering all of Europe. Stalin, for his part, was so paranoid about the idea of being backstabbed that he reportedly dismissed intelligence data, warning that the Nazis were on the brink of invasion. It was a silent, fragile truce, a ticking time bomb that only needed a spark. What set everything ablaze was Hitler's insatiable ambition. Convinced he could eliminate the Soviet threat in a matter of weeks, he ordered the largest invasion force in modern history. Little did either side know that once Barbarossa began, the doors to unimaginable brutality would be thrown wide open. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa with a scale almost beyond comprehension. 3 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and wave after wave of aircraft thundered across the Soviet border. Hitler believed this invasion would be swift and decisive, betting everything on a lightning campaign. At first, his gamble seemed to work. Massive Soviet units were caught off guard, with entire armies encircled in gigantic cauldrons. German panzer divisions ripped through defenses like they were paper, advancing hundreds of miles in mere days. Radio communications within the Red Army turned frantic as generals realized they were losing contact with entire fronts. Some historians claim that Stalin was so stunned he locked himself away, unable to believe how easily the Germans had shattered the peace they'd supposedly agreed upon. Behind the front lines, the chaos had only just begun. While the Soviets struggled to regroup, the German high command believed the war in the East was almost won. Nobody on either side suspected how monstrous the battles would soon become. Even in the opening weeks, a dark side of Barbarossa emerged that few in Germany or the wider world could have predicted. Special squads were sent behind the Wehrmacht's front line, tasked with rooting out perceived enemies, often civilians. Rumors spread of entire villages reduced to ash, with chilling stories of families driven from their homes under the threat of machine guns. Some described being crammed into railroad cars so packed that people collapsed from exhaustion. But it wasn't just one-sided cruelty. Soviet partisans, motivated by raw hatred for the invaders, ambushed German columns, sometimes capturing and violently dispatching stragglers. Hostage-taking and reprisal killings escalated on both sides, each act fueling an inferno of vengeance. Decades later, historians still debate which atrocities were sanctioned from above and which were simply the product of roving bands of men who believed law and order had ceased to exist. The deeper question remains, how much did Hitler and Stalin know about these daily acts of brutality? Both men had reputations for iron-fisted rule. If they did know, did they encourage it? And if they didn't, how did it escalate so quickly? We may never discover every detail, but the systematic cleansing of entire populations and the savage reprisals suggest complicity running straight to the top. Yet, as horrifying as the early months were, they would pale next to what was coming at Stalingrad, where the war's most infamous siege would claim countless lives and shatter illusions on both sides. At first, Stalingrad was not Hitler's primary goal. His sights were set on oil fields in the Caucasus, which he saw as a lifeline for the German war machine. But the city on the Volga bore Stalin's name, and Hitler couldn't resist the symbolic challenge. By late 1942, the German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus had fought its way to the city's outskirts. Then the bombing began. Eyewitnesses described the place turning into a twisted inferno of rubble and fire. Entire blocks vanished. Streets became lethal mazes. Still, Stalin's order was clear: not a step back. Soviet forces clung to the city by their fingernails, launching nighttime counterattacks, snipers lurking in every shadow. Each building was a fortress, each basement a tomb. German soldiers, certain of a quick victory, found themselves mired in a living nightmare. Ammunition began to run low. Winter arrived with a vengeance. Disease spread. Meanwhile, the Soviets had perfected a plan for encirclement. Operation Uranus. In November 1942, they slammed into the Romanian and Italian armies on the German flanks, trapping over 200,000 Axis troops inside Stalingrad. Paulus begged permission to break out, but Hitler refused to concede any retreat. By the time the Sixth Army finally surrendered in February 1943, Stalingrad had become a symbol of hopeless carnage. Rumors from captured German officers revealed that messages had been sent repeatedly to Berlin, warning that a disaster was coming. Yet Hitler dismissed them as cowardly or incompetent. In the end, tens of thousands of German troops succumbed to starvation, freezing temperatures, or the Soviet onslaught. The city was left a smoldering husk, forever etched into the world's consciousness as one of history's most catastrophic sieges. Having tasted victory at Stalingrad, the Soviet High Command wasn't satisfied. They planned an even more decisive blow against German armor. That showdown came at Kursk in July 1943, a place that would witness one of the largest tank battles ever. Over 2,700 tanks on the German side roared into a heavily fortified Soviet bulge, hoping to reclaim the initiative. But Soviet intelligence had cracked much of the German plan. Bunkers, anti-tank traps, and well-coordinated artillery blindsided panzer after panzer, turning fields into massive graveyards of twisted metal. Eyewitness accounts mention treads and turrets scattered like children's toys. The Red Army soon counterattacked with its own waves of T-34 tanks, catching Germany's prized Tigers in lethal crossfires. Behind the scenes, Hitler's generals grew more and more divided. Some believed they should conserve forces and avoid pitched battles they couldn't win. Others demanded one last push to destroy Soviet morale. Disagreements erupted into shouting matches, and in multiple diaries, officers hinted that Hitler's judgment was faltering. More setbacks confirmed their darkest fears. The era of unstoppable blitzkrieg was over, and the Soviet steamroller was gathering momentum. In the months that followed, the Soviet tide grew impossible to contain. As the Red Army advanced through Eastern Europe, many of its soldiers carried a raw fury fed by the atrocities they had witnessed at home. Stories abound of entire German divisions disintegrating under the sheer weight of Soviet armor and artillery. Meanwhile, Hitler's orders to stand and fight at all costs only led to more encirclements and catastrophic losses. Germany's eastern allies, like Romania and Hungary, started to realize their precarious position. Romania flipped sides in 1944, capitulating to the Soviets and turning its weapons on former German comrades in arms. Hungary soon faced chaos as well, culminating in brutal sieges. Hitler's meltdown behind closed doors was almost visible in the desperate telegrams he sent out. Some claimed that by late 1944 he was practically a recluse, refusing to hear any bad news. As the Red Army neared Berlin, darker rumors spread about the Soviet conduct in newly captured territory. Civilians worried about forced relocations or retributions for what the Wehrmacht had done in Soviet regions. The conflict had long surpassed the realm of standard warfare. Now it was raw revenge, an unstoppable avalanche of vengeance that Hitler could do nothing to halt. By May 1945, Berlin fell and Nazi Germany formally surrendered. But for the Eastern Front, the tragedies didn't end with the signature on a document. Of all the nations in the war, the Soviet Union had suffered the heaviest blow. Over 28 million of its citizens perished. Rumors persist that Stalin himself regarded those who'd been captured by Germany as traitors. sending thousands to labor camps in Siberia after liberation. Families were torn apart a second time, this time by their own government's suspicion and paranoia. Meanwhile, Germany lay in ruins. Displaced populations, shattered cities, and countless war crimes weighed heavily on its collective conscience. Eastern Europe faced the beginning of a new era under Soviet influence, a political order that would divide the continent for decades. The hidden dimension is how many critical documents from that era vanished into secret archives, leaving us with only fragments of the entire story. Yet perhaps the most haunting question is whether the world fully grasped the extent of the horrors. Photographs, testimonies, and declassified files keep revealing new layers of agony and deceit. Some communities still search for missing relatives, uncertain if they fell on the battlefield or perished in the gulags. In that sense, the Eastern Front didn't just end with the fall of Berlin. It bled its way into the entire post-war generation. From the thunderous advance of Operation Barbarossa to the nightmarish siege of Stalingrad and the final clash in Berlin's rubble, the Eastern Front left scars on humanity that may never fade. It was a war of extremes, terrifying in scale, savage in its cruelty, and epic in the scope of its devastation. We've peeled back the layers of myths, rumors, and disturbing truths, yet it feels like there's always more buried in the archives, more testimonies left untold. Even decades later, historians continue to debate who knew what and how certain pivotal decisions were made. Entire communities still bear the imprint of that conflict, and its aftermath shaped much of the world order we recognize today. So as we reflect on these staggering events, we must ask ourselves, have we truly understood the full cost paid on the Eastern Front? Or do the real horrors run even deeper than our darkest suspicions? Perhaps the most sobering lesson is that in the ruins of broken cities and mass graves, we find warnings that still echo through time. When ideologies collide at such a monstrous scale, the price can be civilization itself. Are we prepared to remember and to heed those lessons before history repeats itself?